Hello Animorphs fans, let's talk about Cycle 8 of the Animorphs book series. That includes books 36 through to 40 and Megamorphs 4, back to before, the bingo cool one. This is a very interesting cycle, perhaps the most interesting cycle we've had so far, but also the worst. By far and away the worst cycle so far. The average score for these books out of 10 came to a 5.4. That's low. That's really low. That's just for these ones, by the way. If you add in back to before, the average score becomes a 6, which is still very low. So really a dip in quality as we get further into the ghost written books, which is a real shame. The thing about this group of books is that they're so incredibly inconsistent. Look at the scores of these books. 8, 1, 10, 4, 4, 7. Just up and down like a yo-yo. The scores are all over the shop. If you just took out the 3 filler books, you'd have a pretty good little run, even though it'd only be 3 books, The Mutation, The Arrival and Back to Before. But even then, I'm in a minority. I think The Mutation is a very good book. Most of the fan base hates it. If it were up to them, this cycle would score even less. It's really a low scoring round of books, but it is still very interesting nonetheless. It has potential. Unrealised potential, but potential nonetheless. So this is going to be a bit different to my usual cycle reviews because I'm going to talk about how to fix this particular cycle. But let's cover some of the more basic stuff first. Let's talk about best and worst books. You should know this by now. Easily the best, The Arrival. Easily the worst, The Weakness. It goes without saying. It really does. A lot of people might say Back to Before, but I thought it was average. The Arrival surprised me. 10 out of 10. Awesome book. The Weakness, which is still alive, by the way. This is the original ripped to shreds book. I've put it back together with sellotape. You're still alive, The Weakness, and you're charming in how shit you are. Best cover, worst cover. I think the Back to Before cover is one of the best covers in the whole series. I really like the Back to Before cover. If it were down to just these books, I think I selected The Hidden as my best cover because the middle morphs are actually quite nicely done, quite artistically done. The worst one is, without doubt, the other. Just everything about it. Marco is doing this weird angel thing, but he just looks so bored. The person playing Marco just looks so bored and the mid-morphs look goofy. Yeah, it's not a very good cover. That's right, Weakness, you're not the worst at something. Although you do have the worst moments in this particular run. In fact, I always do best moment, worst moment, but pick any page from The Weakness and you'll find a contender for worst moment of the cycle. Possibly worst moment of the entire series. Just choose a random page in that book and you will find something bloody atrocious. But I've picked the part where they fly the plane into the building as my worst moment of this particular cycle. Possibly the worst of the whole series. What an absolute catastrophe of a writing decision. I don't know where it came from. I wish it would just go back to the hell from whence it came. The best moment from this cycle. It was a lot of this cycle is relatively forgettable, except for one moment in particular from The Arrival, and that's when Jake first comes into contact with the 4 new Andalites, meets with them for the first time, and they think they've got one over him, but it turns out he's got one over them. I thought that was a really exciting moment. It put Jake's character in perspective, put the Animorphs as a group into perspective, and also put the Andalites into perspective. Lots of perspective going on. Perception. I don't freaking know. But that was a brilliant moment, summed up where the Animorphs are at this point. And I just thought it was really good. Let's look at character development, shall we? Again, quite interesting. We saw what happens to Tobias if he never becomes an Animorph. He becomes a cultist, essentially. He gives up his individuality, or wants to, for the greater good of the overarching power. So basically he becomes a communist, which is which is quite funny, really. But yeah, that's about as much character development we get from Tobias in this, just knowing where he would have ended up if he hadn't been given the morphing technology. And yeah, that's that. Jake. What do we do with you, mate? In this book, he had a bit of a breakdown, which can be expected. I just don't think you should be making deals with the ultimate enemy, which is a bit of a silly move, Jake, but I just thought that bit was weird anyway, so just forget that exists. What does he do here? In the mutation, I thought one of the best parts of this book was Jake and Cassie. Because all along, Jake has been the leader, he's been making the decisions, all that sort of stuff, but this is one of the times where he is compromised, and it's because of Cassie, because Cassie, in her usual manner, usually she's all peace, love and understanding, but when something affects her personally, she gets enraged, and Jake falls for that, and he starts making decisions for her benefit, and it doesn't pay off. And that was an interesting bit of character development for Jake, the fact that he can be compromised like that, but that by the end, he works to better that. Again, great stuff from Jake in The Arrival, showing how cunning he can be. We've never seen too much of the cunning side of Jake, but it really comes to the forefront in The Arrival, where he can think 2 steps ahead. He's becoming a bit more like Marco in that respect. He's assimilating Marco's way of thinking into his being, and he uses it to full effect in The Arrival. So we are seeing this development of Jake as a leader. And then the other comes along, and that's sort of ruined because I'm going to say, right, The Hidden and The Other, just not canon. As far as I'm concerned, those books do not belong. They don't. This cycle should end. It should go from The Arrival to Back to Before and make that obvious connection. Those 2 books just take up space. And they ruin everything. They ruin that thing, the morphing cube. They sort of ruin thought speak. And yeah, it's just wasted pages, really. Jake has all this suspicion of the Andalites and all that, but in The Other, he just decides, well, fuck that, because he said he likes us, I'm going to trust him. No, that's just bullshit. It's out of character. I'm not counting it in character development because it's stupid. It doesn't belong. The Other needs to go away. Bye-bye, Other. You're next, Hidden. Speaking of the Hidden, let's go over Cassie's character. Apart from establishing that she's an interdimensional being from Back to Before, you just stay away for now, Back to Before. You're your own thing. You just stay over there. I'm dealing with these ones. Cassie. We've seen again in the mutation how she's liable to getting emotional, and that controls her. When she finds out that they're doing experiments on Hork-Bajir, she goes mental. She goes mental, and because of that, Jake becomes compromised. Cassie is a weak aspect to this team, and we don't see that any better than we do in The Hidden. The Hidden, for all its problems, and for it being so close to being off the shelf just like The Other, The Hidden is a summary of Cassie's character. It's not essential, it just rounds her up nicely. It places her nicely where she is in the series now. And there's a little bit of foreshadowing in there when it comes to the morphing cube, how she's always leaving it behind, and Jake at one point says, just keep that with you, do not let that thing out of your sight. And we know what happens in the morphing cube later on in the series, don't we, Cassie? So apart from, yeah, you've got the foreshadowing, you've got the summary of Cassie's character, but this book doesn't belong. It's going off the shelf. It's not canon. Gone. So this cycle is now reduced to these books. We've got a problem. Rachel. What do we do about this character? She's wrecked. She's ruined. The character development is shot. It's in pieces. And that's put into no greater perspective than it is in Back to Before, because that's supposed to be Rachel at book 1 stage Rachel, and she's no different to how she is here in The Weakness. There's been no character development. There have been signs of it in the past, but not really. It's just a facade. She has no character. Well, she has character, but it just doesn't progress. It's just stale, which is a real shame. And this book, The Weakness, thing is, it's not going off the shelf. And I'll explain why in a minute. Marco's character, not really no progress really. I mean, the other's down there now for a reason. It didn't really develop his character at all, so he's had no character development. Axe is an interesting one here. He's a very interesting one. Not only does he start the open war in Back to Before, I mean, that's just in a world of its own. I should really put it back up there with the T-Rex. In fact, yeah, go back up there. Go back. You're just over there. We're dealing with these three, okay? Place you nicely. Axe has a very good book in The Arrival, a really good book, especially for his character, because we've established now that he knows where his duty lies. His duty lies with Jake, and that comes across plain and simple in The Arrival, where from the start he's working with Jake against his own people. We've now seen that come full circle for Axe. So that's really good. That solidifies where his character is at this point. And that brings me on to my next point. This should be the cutoff before the final climax. I know we've got from that point we've got like 6-7 more books to go before we reach that point in the actual series, but this should be the cutoff before we get to, say, book 45. It should be. We've rounded off Axe's character there. Rachel's gone. The character's gone. Jake's in a good position where we've established what he is now. Marco as well. His character's not really developing anymore. Tobias as well. This should be where we hit book 45. But unfortunately, we get stuff like this thrown in, which is just filler, and it's not necessary. It doesn't develop the characters. It doesn't really add to the story. It's unnecessary. We're in a nice position by the end of this one where we can say, right, we know where our characters are now. They've progressed to this point, and it needs to move to the next step. It needs to, else it's just going to feel like a drag. And I get the feeling that the next cycle will be just that, a drag, until we get to about book 45. So, I could be surprised, I could be wrong. Could be a few nice little bits thrown in just to add that little bit more perspective before we get to the final crunch. Now you may be asking why I've left the weakness up here when those other two have gone down there. I think this book had the potential. These books all did. Even The Hidden, perhaps. Maybe I should... No, I shouldn't really. I should say down there. It needs to be completely different, The Hidden. What needed to happen here was these all needed to be better connected. This whole cycle of books felt disjointed, like the authors weren't talking to each other. Prime example, we get to the end of The Arrival. In the middle of The Arrival, the Animorphs are told the Andalites aren't coming. That's big news. And there's part of that book, I know it was a facade, but where the Animorphs are saying, why are we doing this? Case in point, Cassie. Why are we still killing Hork-Bajir? How are we justifying that? If there's no hope, if the Andalites aren't coming, what's the point? That should be the plot for the next Cassie book. This book, yeah, that's the right one. This book should have further explored that. And that would have fit. And that could have led into Back to Before, where we get the whole bit about Jake saying, what's the point? I wish we could just go back to things how they were. That would have connected it all. Instead, we get the whole Buffalo plot line, which is just irrelevant and nonsense. We should have, after this one, had that book where we're with Cassie's narration, and she's got this question through her head. How am I justifying this now that the Andalites aren't coming? Instead, we don't hear from that again. Such a big plot point. The Andalites aren't coming. The big thing we've been waiting for, the big thing we've been trying to delay the Yerks for, that's now not happening. Why is that not the plot point from that point on? Why isn't it? It should be. 39 should have been a completely different book, and it would have worked better. It would have been better context for this book here in particular. Book 40 could have sold it off for all I care. But not only that, these two books as well, The Mutation and The Weakness, could have fit together so perfectly. And that could have gone into The Arrival as well. Put it like this, okay? So in The Mutation, Jake is compromised by Cassie, okay? That means that the other team members are looking at him saying, how did you allow this? Why are you allowing this thing to happen? Why are emotions now coming into it? What's the weakness all about? Rachel taking charge. Jake is away. And Rachel is in charge. She decides, right, I'm the leader now. Why has the simple connection not been made? Simple. This book, Rachel, halfway through the book, says, right, Jake, why are you making these stupid orders from Cassie? Why are you doing this? Demoralise. Just alienated from the group at that point. That should lead into the weakness. Maybe something big happens at the start of the book where Jake once again is compromised by Cassie. And it'd even be a great dynamic because Rachel and Cassie are best friends, and that would be what splits them apart. And Rachel goes off and says, right, I've had it at this, Jake. You're making stupid decisions now. You're no longer the leader. That would have been brilliant, and it would have set up the weakness to be less of the turd than it is. Why didn't we make that connection, writers? Well, you're not talking to each other. It should be simple. It should be obvious. That is a logical sequence. It's tension. It's drama. It's unpredictable. Instead, what do we get? Oh, Jake's away, so I'm the leader now. No connection to this previous book at all, where we had that big thing about Jake's compromise. We didn't get any of that. It was just, oh, now new book. Reset. It's like Family Guy or South Park, where every episode is just a stone cold reset. That's what this particular cycle felt like, every episode. Despite the things that happened in those books, like 38, the big main plot point, suddenly the next book comes along, oh, it's like it never happened. It's bizarre and disjointed, and it just feels wrong. What should have happened between the weakness and the arrival? Maybe continue with the whole separation of the Animorphs into the Jake faction and the Rachel faction. And then the arrival comes along and then you get the big news of the Andalites aren't coming. That's a big bombshell to throw onto those two factions. And what happens then? You get the next book, The Hidden, with Cassie having this moralization. Maybe she somehow brings them back together. And then we go into the final push, bring 45 along. Big final push. That would have fixed this cycle. It would have been interesting. It would have been logical. But it didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Why did we end up with The Hidden and the other, which are just total filler? The weakness was a weakness because it just had no logic to it when it could have. It could really have had that logic. It could have been a really good book. It could have. It had that potential. As long as you took out the bloody 9/11 moment in it. Anyway, that's this cycle. It's, as I say, it's interesting because there's something there. It could have been so much better. But I think the lack of maybe they were communicating, I don't know. It just feels like they weren't. There's loads of big plot points that just were not connected. And if they were to be connected, I think they would make a really strong run. But they just weren't. They were just scattered. And that's a shame. But it did have good moments. The Arrival is an awesome book. The Mutation's a good book. That one, I can take it or leave it. The others just... be gone. you go down there. I'm surprised you stayed up on the shelf that long, really, but yeah. So if you keep those 3 books, it's a pretty good run. Top. Right, that's this cycle done. Next up, we're going to be looking at that book, which is Animorphs, and we're going to do a full read of that one as well. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I shall see you next time. Ta-ra.